Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we are continuing with the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, Yogananda's commentary, Yogananda's explanation of the Bhagavad Gita written by his disciple, Swami Kriyananda. And we are on chapter 2, stanza 64 of the Gita. And it says, "The man of perfect self-control is able to act in this world unaffected by it. Inwardly free from attraction and repulsion, he has attained unshakable inner calmness." I was meditating a lot on this verse. The man of perfect self-control is able to act in the world unaffected by it. You know, this is the great mystery of divine incarnation, and this whole book is a conversation between the avatar Krishna and his highly advanced disciple Arjuna about how you live in the world. And the whole thing started, this is also about meditation and inward realities, of course, because you can't separate the two. But the whole dialogue, which is the Bhagavad Gita, starts when Arjuna has to engage in this war. And he doesn't want to engage in the war, and he balks completely at engaging in the war. And then he makes everything stop, Arjuna does, while Krishna discusses with him whether or not he's going to participate in this war. So it's the most extreme example of how, of action in this world. A war, the necessity to pick up a weapon to oppose other human beings, to be killed or to kill them, certainly does not feel like a dharmic way to live. And plus, the intensity of such an experience would naturally have a huge effect on one's equanimity and inner calmness and self-control and all of those elements of yoga. So when Krishna makes this statement, the man of perfect self-control is able to act in the world unaffected by it. You have to think also of the context in which he's saying it. He's not just saying, eat your breakfast, in a God-reminding way. He's talking about being drawn into the most extreme actions, virtually, that you can imagine on the planet, and still be unaffected by it, which is an interesting word. It's that we're always living on these two levels, which is these two levels simultaneously, which is the higher reality of our superconscious connection to the infinite reality of creation, and then there's that spark of divinity which is just stretched out down to the destiny of this little ego, and it has to play out all of these forces that seem to move us into one karma or another. The whole story of how Arjuna ends up, which we've talked about in earlier sessions, how Arjuna ends up in the chariot with Krishna, facing this very difficult reality of having to go to war with his own cousins. It describes the whole force of karma, how an individual cannot separate himself from the reality into which he was born. Recently, as some of you know, the timing of this particular recording, which is now the end of January of 2019, just in the earlier part of this same month, I was in Israel, and the man who was guiding us is an Orthodox Jew, a modern Orthodox. There's all these shades of distinction when you get inside these things. And we were comparing points of view, and he said something about the tradition of his ancestors. And I had no wish to, at all, to disrupt his commitment to his own teaching. It's the right teaching for him, and he wasn't asking me for another point of view, so it needs to be dealt with respectfully. But when he said something about the tradition of your ancestors, it was appropriate for me to say, well, I believe in reincarnation, so it gets to be a little complicated as to who your ancestors are. if in one incarnation you're an Israeli Jew, in another incarnation you're a Hindu, and then you move to Peru, lifetime after lifetime, for those who came before you, to which group do you really belong? But the other side of it is, even a master, his incarnation is determined, what he is able to express of the infinite consciousness he has is determined by the time and place in which he is born. I mean, that's how a master's entire mission comes to pass. There's a specific divine need, and the soul responds to that need. And then once he assumes that body, he has to act according to that need. Yogananda, as an obvious example, was born in India, grew up in India, was trained in India by an Indian guru, but then in his early 20s, he came to America, and the majority of his life, except for like a year and a half when he went back to India, was all spent in the West, in the United States specifically. And what Yogananda was able to convey of everything that he had to draw on, which was literally the infinity of Sanatana Dharma, was determined entirely by where he was, what the people could understand. He had to express everything exactly in those terms. It was the karma of the incarnation, if it wasn't the karma of him personally. You look at Jesus Christ, having been recently in Israel, of course, I'm thinking about Jesus. Jesus was an avatar to the Jewish people. He came to reestablish the Sanatana Dharma nature of Judaism as presented by Moses from the beginning. Judaism is a true religion. And Jesus had to tailor his message to what the people around him could hear. For example, the concept of God that the Jewish people of that time were devoted to was God as the judge. And the criteria for the response of God to you, according to the way they taught at that time, was the degree to which you conformed to divine law, the Mosaic law, beginning with the Ten Commandments, but everything else that Moses laid out is the guidelines for the people. And of course, at that time, the Jews were coming out of slavery and learning to be an independent people, and they needed to understand many things. And it was also Kali Yuga descending. It was still Kali Yuga descending when Jesus came, but he came with a different message. But he was able to speak of God as the Father, bringing the concept more into the heart from God being the judge. But he wasn't able to speak of the Mother explicitly. He spoke of the Comforter, which was the way he brought in the reality that the divine is also feminine in its expression, because the Comforter is the longing of the heart. The longing of the heart for comfort is a tremendous power. But it wasn't possible for Jesus to speak of the Mother because it was taking the people he'd come to serve, taking them farther. It was too much of a step. But when Yogananda came, one of the specific aspects of his mission was to take the mass consciousness, so to speak, from seeing God just as the Father to seeing God also as the Mother. And this has nothing to do with men and women, and it's not about feminism or anything like that. It's that the divine is both masculine and feminine. It's the calm, impersonal wisdom of the Father and the all-forgiving comfort of the Mother. Just as in an ideal human being, both of those things exist simultaneously. So in the divine, every longing of the heart is there. So all of this is a long moving aside from this simple phrase to be able to act in the world and be unaffected by it, which is that once we take a human body, even an avatar, is what I was saying, even an avatar, his incarnation is molded by his circumstances. His karma is not personal. It's an impersonal divine mission, and the karma of his disciples also defines what he can say, how he can say it, how much he can say, what kind of practices he recommends. The guru is drawn back time and again to help those disciples, and those disciples advance their own spiritual progress by supporting the guru in the mission that he comes to serve. But all of it ends up with us being compelled to act in the world. I mean, a rare few, the only action they have to take is perhaps to go into a hermit's retreat and meditate. But nonetheless, they're compelled by some aspect of their past karma and the necessity of life to act. And there's, I think we already went through, or it's in front of us, action, inaction, actionlessness, nishkam karma, acting without desire for the fruits, all of these different ways in which we have to act, but nonetheless we act. Unless we're beyond duality, we are compelled in one way or another to participate. So the question that Arjuna is asking is whether he even has to participate. And Krishna is saying yes, but in the right way. So the man of perfect self-control is able to act in the world unaffected by it because he is inwardly free from the opposites, attraction and repulsion. And therefore he has attained inner calmness. So a great deal of yoga is talking about this fact that we have this point of stillness within us, and that action itself does not contradict that stillness. Because if we have self-control, the phrase he uses is unshakable inner calmness. That we're not suddenly feeling, oh, I have to have it this way, I can't have it that way. That's what attraction and repulsion is about. And it disturbs our inner calmness, because if we don't have, or we do have, one way or another, our inner reality becomes conditioned by circumstances in the world, which by their very definition will not remain the same. So we get it all set up to match exactly what we're attracted to, and then something happens. And the only way we can avoid being tossed about is if we have the self-control to realize that my happiness is not conditioned. I can act in this world, but I'm unaffected by it. Now, the human mind tends to think, and oftentimes I've seen people who are trying to be spiritual and sincerely trying to be spiritual, that means that our reactions are dulled, that we simply don't participate. And I've spoken about this theme many times through the course of this, because it's something that in my many years living in close association with Swami Kriyananda, the subtlety of the way he was able to act in this world and be unaffected by it was something that I was constantly trying to understand, and have been constantly trying to understand it even to this day. Because the inclination is to protect yourself. But even to protect yourself from too much excitement, from too much sorrow, from too much feeling, is to be compelled by attraction and repulsion. And what we really have to be, Swamiji once suggested to me that I should try to be more like a sieve, he said, instead of a wall. In other words, when things came toward me, I should just let them pass through me, rather than having a response that starts a reaction. Later in this readings that we're working with today, Swami uses the example of when you throw a rock into a pond, and the ripples go out from that rock, and then they hit the shore of the pond, and then they come back, and then they meet the ripples that are still emanating from the center, and pretty soon you have this reaction going on. Swami was trying to explain to me that when I respond like with a hard surface, then of course everything begins to move like this. But if you make yourself a sieve, then you can receive whatever comes. You accept it completely, but it just passes through you. You act in relation to it, but you are unaffected by it. And that would be it pretty much, if I think about it, how Swami was about things. And by that I don't mean that he didn't respond, but he didn't feel the need to resist. And I think that's what Swami was trying to tell me, to act in this world without being affected by attraction and repulsion. Attraction reaches out and grabs and tries to hold. Repulsion tries to push away, like that. Now, is this easy? Not even slightly. I mean, this is the whole spiritual path, because we are deeply conditioned, being in human bodies, and deeply conditioned from our many incarnations of suffering and happiness, which tend to just sort of alternate in this never-ending cycle. I believe Master it was who described, pleasure as the interval between two pains, and pain is the interval between two pleasures. And how long that cycle is, it doesn't matter, because in duality, if our happiness is conditioned by circumstances, sooner or later circumstances will shift. It's the nature of this world. I've watched my body age, and it's just fascinating to be older. I absolutely love being older, because you have such a better perspective. And I hope, and you've heard me say this before, I want to have this perspective from the time that I'm a young child. I want to be an old woman as a young child, from the point of view of knowing how ephemeral it all is. Which, of course, to a certain extent I did, because I was so serious about life from a very young age and came to the path before I was 20. So clearly I was pretty set on it from some previous life. But even through my 20s and 30s and 40s, it was just hard to know. It was hard to keep the perspective. But the perspective of being in my 70s now is just to realize it just flows. One incarnation just comes and goes. And the only important thing is that you just keep your focus, which of course I have, but I certainly rode a lot more waves than I would like to ride the next time. I acted a lot in this world, but I was also deeply affected in the way that Krishna cautions against, not in the impersonal, how can I serve way, that is the way of the divine. Swami goes so far as to say you really can't be totally unaffected until you're in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So we have to be a little nice to ourselves, which is what our next section is about. In the section before this, Swamiji asked, in the last class it would have been, because it would have been the stanza before, Swami is talking about the ways of delusion and the ways of freedom, and he says, the first question then that the devotee has to ask is, do I like suffering? And Swami says, no, obviously. This is in the text. He says, no, obviously. But next the devotee has to ask, what increases suffering and what, on the other hand, lessens it? So there's a very subtle point here, which is from last class, but I also want to bring it up here, which is we have to come to the point where we recognize that we are suffering, and that what causes, we have to then be able to ask the question, have the courage to ask the question, and have the awareness to answer it honestly. And because we tend to think what causes us suffering is what's happening outside of us, but we gradually come to realize that what is causing me suffering is not what's happening outside myself, which I can't control, but what is going on inside myself, and how I react to what happens to me, given that we are compelled to act. So there has to be a very deep longing to escape suffering before you can even seriously get on the spiritual path. And I do believe that is the one characteristic I carried over from previous incarnations, because I was profoundly focused on happiness. And I didn't think of it so much as escaping pain. I thought of it more in the positive, which is how to ensure happiness. But that kind of intense focus on happiness has to come, it's the obvious corollary to the desire to escape pain. And I remember when I was in college, I only went to college for 1 year, but during that first year of college, it wasn't a satisfactory situation for me. I was not destined for university life. And to a certain extent, I made the pronouncement, which I think was a bit arrogant, but nonetheless it had truth in it, that the whole situation for college students was just impossible, because we were grown up in many ways, but we were still trapped in a kind of, I don't know, child's universe, where we really were just biding our time. We didn't really have the opportunity to meaningfully participate in life, but we were old enough to be doing that. I know a friend of mine, Narayani, who wrote the wonderful book, My Heart Remembers Swami Kriyananda. And she talked about when she came to the age when her parents expected her to go to college, her point of view on it was simply, well, after I go to college, all I'm going to do is get a job anyway. So why don't I just skip that whole middle stage and just go out and get a job right away? She said later she learned from life rather than learning from books. It wasn't her temperament. But it was a simple way that we were ready to participate in life as adults. At least I was, and a lot of people around me were. But we weren't able to. And as a result, there was this sort of constant confusion. At least that's what I saw around me. But I realized, and I remember articulating at the time, that my relation to happiness was a little different than at least some of the women that I met when I was 18. Because happiness was so important to me that I was willing to change in order to have it. Whereas I observed that many of the unhappy women around me just wanted to be unhappy until circumstances changed around them. And I saw that even then, without having any exposure to the spiritual path, that this was an ocean of difference between us. That my suffering had been so acute, not in this incarnation, but obviously in previous incarnations, that I was willing to take responsibility to have it end. And that's the point we have to come to in our spiritual path. Now, let's go to chapter 2, verse 65. With the attainment of soul bliss, every vestige of sorrow disappears. Isn't that a wonderful promise? That's my editorial comment. Isn't that a wonderful promise? Bliss gives perfect discrimination and soon establishes one's consciousness firmly in the self, the divine self. There's a few points there that are really interesting. First, bliss is the opposite of sorrow here. When we have bliss, sorrow disappears, because bliss is elevating us above the oscillations of duality. Bliss is not holding duality on the side of attachment and away from the side of repulsion. Bliss is transcending the opposites and living in the state, the singularity of divine awareness, and no longer being affected by the never-ending ups and downs of the material world. So it says not merely that sorrow disappears, but every vestige of sorrow disappears. The very condition in which sorrow can exist, which is the illusion that the temporary world is the real world. And once we just realize that it's a movie, and that it's going on endlessly, and that we step in and out of it with birth and death, and that it never has a lasting truth, then it's impossible for sorrow to intrude upon that realization. Toward the end of his life, Swami Kriyananda more and more lived constantly in that bliss. He himself spoke of it. In a certain way, he explained that Master had kept that experience from him through the early part of his life, because if he had been able to go into that state as easily as he did at the end of his life, the incentive to do all the work that he did wouldn't have been there. Master himself told Swamiji that he had realization, he had self-realization, but it was being held back from him because of the work he had to do. So he did the work, and then when the work was done, which, was the last decade of his life or so, he just allowed himself to, let's put it more exactly, he allowed that to manifest without restraint. Whereas prior to that it had been restrained. That was really less than the last decade, just the last few years of his life. It was really extraordinary to see it, because it was just bubbling over, often pouring out of him as tears. He would often say, I feel so much bliss, I just don't know what to do with myself. He never allowed his feelings to show the way he let them show at the end of his life. It was quite remarkable. It was very interesting too, his teaching, especially toward the very end. He almost always just talked about the same subject, no matter what he was supposed to talk about, whatever the topic was. He would talk about meeting Master. And he would often tell the story of reading autobiography of a yogi and coming across the country as soon as he'd finished reading it, and then being initiated by Master and living with Master. It was like everything else just became insignificant. His entire and only reality was Guru's grace and the bliss that it gave him even to contemplate it. Which brings me to the second line of this stanza. Bliss gives perfect discrimination. That was a very interesting phrase. I was enjoying thinking about it today. One of the things that made my life so disconcerting until I was 19 and was introduced to the teachings of self-realization was that I had no fixed point of reference, is the only way I can put it. I was just, it was like nobody could talk to me about truth. One of the reasons I became so disenchanted at university, I went to Stanford University, which was a very prestigious place. It was prestigious then. It is even more so now. It was possible for an ordinary mortal to be admitted into Stanford at that time, which was me. I would never be admitted today. I didn't have the record for it, but then I could be. But in any case, I was eager to go there because I had not found anyone to guide me. My parents were fine people, and I gained a great deal that was positive from them. But I never felt that they understood the secret of life and the keys to happiness in the ways that I was searching for them. And I anticipated that when I got to Stanford University, that I would encounter true wisdom. And within a week, really, of being there, I was appalled to realize that my professors had no greater understanding of life than I did. And in some ways I was their equal, which was extremely upsetting to me. Not their equal in knowledge, intellectuality, an accumulation of information or specialized skills. I mean, there were many, many things, of course, that they knew that I didn't know. But they didn't have the one thing I was interested in, which was a fixed point of reference that was based on some, at least, that would appear to me at least to be some bedrock of actual truth. And that actual truth would be measured by the degree to which it guaranteed a diminution of pain and an increase of happiness. And when I didn't find that, I absolutely lost interest in university life, which was, as I said, about in the first week. I lasted for a year because I honestly just didn't know what to do with myself. In retrospect, if I had appreciated how much it cost my parents to keep me there for that year, I might have dropped out sooner, but I think I needed it in order to sort my life out. But what happened when I was 19, which was about a week or two after my first year of college ended, just before I turned 19, someone handed me the book by Swami Vivekananda. And those of you who've listened to me speak have heard this story before, but when I was handed that book by Vivekananda, and I don't really actually even remembering, I remember reading the book, but the process that I remember is more like I just opened it to a certain page, which I don't think is really what happened, but that's how it feels to me. And I realized that Vivekananda was speaking to me from from the bedrock of reality. Of course, this has always been the genius of India, which is that the teaching of Sanatana Dharma is not an accumulation of information. It is a direct perception by great rishis of that which is. One of the definitions of Sanatana Dharma, which is the right word to express the teachings of India, the teachings that have always been associated with India. One definition is eternal religion, the other is that which is not really a dogmatic statement. Because it's a revelation, not an idea. All the great sages of all religions actually come together in the direct perception. Saint Teresa of Avila spoke exactly like the Vedas because she saw it. She saw that which is. She rose above duality and perceived reality and described it. And so all religions come together. That's why Yogananda said self-realization is the unifying principle behind all religions. And he didn't mean self-realization fellowship or Ananda Church of self-realization. He meant the principle of self-realization, because that principle leads to revelation. And direct revelation of infinity is the same infinity it has to be. So bliss is the inevitable result of that perception, because what we perceive is Satchidananda, and the nature of Satchidananda is ever new joy, is infinite bliss. So what that experience of bliss gives a person, and I speak in principle and only in the tiniest way from experience, but what that gives us is it gives us what I call a fixed point of reference. And that's what happened when I read Vivekananda. Somebody has principles that are based on revelation and not on opinion, that are based on experience and not on information. And it's a fixed point of reference by which all my other experiences can now be judged. I mean, what also happened for me, just to volley back and forth between the masters and myself, was that I realized that the key to it all was my inner consciousness. So the fixed point of reference became, how am I doing in my inner consciousness, which of course is always with me. So it wasn't a question of whether I was excelling at my work or getting good grades in university or had the right relationship or whether people liked me or any of the other sort of mutable realities in which I had been living up to that point, because they were this way one day and that way the next day. I mean, I had just come through childhood and adolescence in which, just from year to year, everything shifts. You can't even wear the same clothes. Everything changes. So the idea that there was a point of reference that would not change gave me, well, I feel in a certain sense like I'd been holding my breath until that point. And I was finally able to exhale in relief just by the mere fact that it existed. So once we get that fixed point of reference, we gradually begin to understand that that fixed point of reference is bliss. Because, as Master said in Science of Religion, which was the book he wrote. It was actually ghost written for him, but it was his ideas. His revelation to bring to the West. The science of religion is just what I said. Everyone wishes to escape pain and to find happiness. This is what everyone wants. And self-realization is the way to escape pain and to find happiness. So what we find is not just happiness, but bliss, which is our own nature. And our own nature as bliss, and the experience of that bliss, whether it's fixed in nirvikalpa samadhi or just occasionally glimpsed when we happen to get in tune with it, it becomes the fixed point of reference around which everything else is measured. So discrimination itself is the ability to discern, discern the nature of things, and to discern in terms of our own self what will bring us greater happiness and what will bring us greater suffering. And the difficulty is we're always losing our footing on this, which is what some of these other stanzas talk about as we go through this. We get swept away by sensory experience, or we get drawn into Maya, and we have this idea in our mind, and we even have this experience, we even have this heart conviction that this is the pathway for me to bliss. But we get swept away. But bliss itself, having ever experienced it or ever glimpsed it, it becomes the point of reference, and our discrimination is grounded in whether or not this particular choice, this particular action, this reaction, this attachment, this repulsion, whether it increases or decreases that bliss. And that's where the power of discrimination comes from. We can do it intellectually. Does it match the teachings? Is it in the Talmud? Is it in the Bible? Is it what my guru says? Is it according to the tradition of my ancestors? We can say all of these. Does it match my blood type? Does it match my whatever the Ayurvedic thing, which I can't remember right at the moment, which dosha I am? Just all of these different things, my horoscope, all of these different questions. But the real question is, the unchanging question is, does it increase or decrease my bliss? Just as simple as that. I remember Swamiji told us, and attunement, told us a long story once, which was very touching, about it, and he brought it out in terms of attunement with Master, with his Guru, as being the key to his inner bliss. And he talked about going to India and living in India after Master had passed, and Master had been gone for a while. And there he met a disciple, probably a disciple of Lahiri Mahashaya. And Lahiri Mahashaya is in our line of gurus, and it was Lahiri who was initiated by Babaji and carried Kriya down from the Himalayas back into the world, which is the ray of grace that all of us who are disciples of Master are still riding. And this disciple talked to Swamiji about a number of higher Kriya initiations. Now Swamiji wasn't quite 26 when Master died, and he had only been with Master for 3.5 years, and Master fast-tracked him, you might say, and poured a great deal of energy into him, but Swamiji just wasn't there long enough and didn't have enough time, he reasoned in his own mind, perhaps to learn everything that Master might have taught him if Master had lived longer. So this disciple was offering him initiation into several levels of Kriya that Swami hadn't had. The difficulty was that in order to learn those, because it is the nature of Kriya, that the learning is not just by transmitting information. The learning involves taking initiation, and then the information is transmitted after the initiation. So Swami said he meditated on it and he thought about it, and he thought, well, this is our line of gurus, and if I'd had more years with Master, it's quite likely that he would have taught me this. So Swamiji decided to take the initiation and learn the higher techniques. So he did, and then he began to practice them. And several months passed, and then Swamiji, and he told us all of this later. I don't recall now whether he told us about taking the initiation right after he came back from India, or only told us the whole story after it had all been resolved. But after a number of months, and it might have been as long as 6 months, Swamiji was acutely aware of a noticeable decrease in his inner sense of attunement to Master, and a notable decrease of his inner bliss. And he said when he reflected on it, he realized that it all started when he took initiation from that man. So Swamiji, without casting any aspersions on the man himself or his worthiness to give initiation or even the efficacy of the teachings, but Swamiji said that his relationship was to Master and that it was not appropriate for him to go seek initiation anywhere else. So he repudiated both the initiation and he put down the techniques that he learned. He said as soon as he did it, his previous state of attunement and bliss was restored to him. Now, what this is about is that Swami was able to discriminate what was the right course for him because he had a point of reference. And his point of reference was the bliss of his attunement to Master. And because he had experienced that, it took him time, and it's a very useful story for many different reasons, but not the least of which is even a person whose discrimination is very finely honed, we can still get pulled aside. We can still get pulled away. We're not safe until we're in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. We still can get pulled away. But bliss gives us discrimination because bliss is our fixed point of reference. And once we realize that that bliss is not with us or is diminished in any way, which sometimes takes longer than you might think because other kinds of magnetism replace it and we don't notice right away. That's why it's interesting. It certainly was several months. As I said, it might have been as long as 6 months, but I don't want to say for sure, before the whole cycle for Swamiji had run. So now the next stanza is number 2, chapter 2, number 66. Those with unsettled consciousness have no discrimination. Those who are unmeditative cannot know peace, and for those who lack peace, how is happiness possible? Well, unsettled consciousness is having no fixed point of reference. Right, no fixed point of reference. If I was going to describe myself prior to the time I was handed the book by Vivekananda, and especially prior to the time I met Swami Kriyananda, unsettled would probably be the most dramatic, the kindest word you could use. My consciousness was completely unsettled. It had no point of reference. And so I felt, as I would joke about it, I felt like a rock just rolling down a perpetual hill. There was just no point of rest. And so without a point of rest, we have no point from which to discriminate. We have no principles by which we can discriminate. But when we are settled in one reality, then it's possible to be able to measure against that. And the stanza speaks of peace. Without peace and calmness, how can we ever be happy? Because we're always caught between attraction and repulsion. Stanza 67 says, as a boat moving on water may be swept off its course by a gale, so discrimination may be swept from its path by the vagaries of sensory influence. And this is what I was saying earlier, and this is where Swami begins the stanza a few stanzas before. Until we're in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, until we're completely finished with this world and absolutely settled, we're always we're always going to be subject to this. Something could happen to us. And how far we wander and for how long, and this is what Swami talks about now in the next section of commentary, depends not on whether or not we get blown off course, because that's inevitable. It's how strongly we have anchored ourselves in our point of reference. And so Swami makes a reference here, and he quotes Master's beautiful chant, "I have made thee pole star of my life, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy." And it's so sweetly put. And we're talking to God, we're talking to the Guru. When I had to write, when I was writing the book about Swami Kriyananda, which here, as I said, it's January 2019, it's about to go to the printer. So in just a few months we'll have it in our hands. I had to really try to think, who was Swamiji in my life? I mean, you can say teacher, you can say guru, and all of those are true ways to describe him. But the word that actually has worked the best for me is pole star, because it's that fixed point of reference. I have a friend who is an astronomer, and I remember we were in a car driving somewhere at night, and I think we were in sort of a dark neighborhood or something like that, we were going down more of a major street, but we were completely lost. This was way before GPS and having your phone and just being able to find you. We were just lost. We didn't know where we were. And he pulled off the busy street and drove down into a dark neighborhood, then got out of the car and looked at the stars. And he actually figured out where we were and how we had gone wrong from the configuration of the stars. I mean, it was just absolutely marvelous. Then he just got back in the car and drove to where we were trying to go. But of course, they're fixed points of reference that he was used to, and he was an expert, and it was a world that he knew. And the pole star, historically, when sailors were out on the sea and people were wandering across the wilderness long before there were any other methods, it was a fixed point. It was the fixed point of reference, and you could always know where you were. And you could just keep your consciousness focused on that, and everything else would fall into place. And that, to me, is the most dynamic way I can describe how Swami Kriyananda affected my life. I mean, to this day, it was interesting. I'm not mindless. I've never been mindless. In fact, in my acceptance of what Swamiji says, in fact, I was remembering one conversation we had where he had proposed something, and I was resisting him, as I often resisted him. He actually used the word thwarted him, was the word he used. I often thwarted him, asserting my own ideas against his. So even though I speak of this relationship, I insisted on my own intellectual integrity in it. I was compelled by it, and I only came to agreement when I honestly came to agreement. But I remember once he got impatient with me, and we were on the phone, and he just said, "Asha, you always agree with me in the end, so why don't you just be quiet and think about it?" Which I guess I had advanced to the point where he could say that to me. And it stayed with me. And I reacted less and tried to discriminate more. But nonetheless, his presence in my life, his teachings, the effect of knowing him has been the pole star for me. It's everything is measured in relation to it. I mean, I realized I learned to cook. He taught me how to cook. I didn't know how to cook at all when I first came to Ananda. I took over the kitchen without knowing how to cook. The big kitchen that cooked for most of the community, and I took it over without knowing how to cook, which was a little painful for the people who had to eat what I made. I knew how to be healthy. I didn't really understand that it also had to please the palate. So Swamiji took me in hand and taught me how to cook. He basically taught me how to cook over a 2-day period by merely having me stand next to him while he cooked. And there was some transference of consciousness. I wish other things that I've needed to learn in my life could have been learned so easily. But he awoke a certain intuition. And I learned to cook, and I became quite good at it. I don't do it much anymore, but I was people were happy when I was cooking. I mean, they were happy that I was cooking. But I realized that my whole style and way of cooking, and what I tended to make and everything, it was entirely based around what Swamiji liked. I mean, I cooked for myself differently, but my cooking was always according to what his preferences were. And he was a little bit picky in many ways. He himself admitted it. But that was what I did. That's how I did it. I measured it according to whether or not it would please him. He was my pole star in something as small as that. But it was a fixed point of reference. And I thought to myself, when I finally realized that, it took me years to realize that was true. I thought, well, it's as good as any other and better than most. Why not? Why not? And so, but the effect of that is much greater, because when you have a fixed point of reference, you can discriminate. And so even to this day, I constantly explain everything in terms of, well, that's what Swami said about it. And what I was trying to say is that's not a dogma to me. It's not like, well, Swami said it, therefore we have to do it. Someone once tried to sort of correct me for being dogmatic, and I'm not at all dogmatic. But to my mind, if we're going to start a discussion, it would be helpful to start with a point of view that is more likely to be true than my own. And even if after we start there, we realize that if Swamiji were here right now, he would give a different answer. Friends of mine and I were discussing, Swami had made a certain statement that we ought to do a certain something in a certain way, and it was not being done that way anymore. And we were saying that we could all hear Swami saying, well, that is what I said before, but I think in these circumstances, this is the right way to do it. I mean, part of what Swami said was, you have to respond to the circumstances you're in. That was his greatest principle, is that you have to relate to reality as it is. You can't just assert your dogma and try to make reality conform to your dogma. But that's very different than having a pole star. Having a pole star is to realize that there is a fixed point of reference for me, for a disciple, for a devotee. Swamiji was the living representative in my life of Paramhansa Yogananda. My understanding of Yogananda's teachings came through Swamiji. I understand Master only through Swamiji. So he's the pole star that I have to follow, because the way he explained Master's teaching is the way I need to live them. And when my experience, my decisions, my experience diverges from that, I have to be very sure that I know what I'm doing and why. One of my friends jokingly, Swami's leadership, as I've written in this book, and you can read in a couple of months, you can read it all. His leadership, he was very, very understated in his leadership, so there was often a lot of discussion. What does he really know? What doesn't he know? And a friend of mine once, in a very homely way, put it. He said, well, if you do it the way Swamiji suggests, it works. And if you don't, it don't. Which, over many years, that's what I've also come to understand, which is, if he suggested, especially if it was, if he suggested that we follow a certain course of action, it was generally wiser at least to take that very seriously. And if you diverge from it, to have a conscious awareness of what you are doing and why. Because it's not dogma, it's directional, it's energy, but to have a conscious awareness of what you're doing and why. You know what the fixed point is, and then discrimination becomes possible. And, bliss is a very interesting word to come back to, with bliss gives perfect discrimination. We think of bliss only as this, this experience, this ecstatic experience. But bliss has so many dimensions to it. Swami described love as bliss in action, which is, I can't explain that more because I'm still reflecting on it. But love is bliss in action. And bliss is one of the 8 manifestations of God, and it's Satchidananda, it's the ever-existing, ever-conscious, ever-new joy, which is the very definition of God in infinity. But we pull little bits of bliss down. So it's not just the ecstatic experience as outside of human life. It's that thread of upliftment and of wisdom and of calmness, all the 8 manifestations of peace. That bliss filters down, and all of those qualities, joy is bliss, but all of those qualities are the bliss that gives us perfect discrimination. I have this, I have this inclination toward truth, toward wisdom, as bliss in action. That's the way bliss expresses, is a feeling of being aligned with truth, and that's where Swamiji is a pole star. If I'm in alignment with that vibration and that teaching, then I'm closer to my center of bliss, and everything works better from there. So Swamiji also talks here, and I think in these last few minutes I want to really just touch on this. I may have to come back to this next session, we'll see. But Swami talks about the fact that the gale force of Maya, has the capacity to take everyone off course. And the idea that our spiritual path is going to be without a slip or a fall is not based on discrimination. It's based on wishful thinking. So inherent in understanding how to follow the spiritual path is not the thought that I will never be blown off course. Swami just says that emphatically. We will all be blown off course. Some vritti will arise, some force of temptation. Maya in all its different forms is very, very powerful. So we also must know how to deal with this. And Swami goes into the question of guilt. He said, because instead of agitating ourselves with feelings of guilt and with self-accusation, which he said, which only increase our susceptibility to delusion, the devotee should remain calmly on his pre-established course, is how he put it. So we're on course, we get blown off course, and instead of becoming overwhelmed with self-accusation for that inevitable failure, he says, and this is the point, that self-accusation and guilt only increases our susceptibility to delusion because it emphasizes our separateness from God, from infinity, from bliss. And anything that emphasizes our separateness, you see, that's what guilt is. All of a sudden, instead of being a part of a greater reality, of being an instrument of divine, a child of God, we suddenly we're clinging to this smallness of ourselves and insisting, that we stand separate from that. So what happens, among many other things, besides it being an egoic response, it's not, we think that ego is only puffing ourselves up, but, I'll give it this way, true humility is self-honesty. And guilt is not self-honesty. Of course we were blown off course. That we're not established in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. What did we expect? Mistakes are inevitable. And all we should do is calmly return to our pre-established course. And whether we return a decade later, an incarnation later, 5 minutes later, a day later, that's the only possible response. If we start obsessing about our own personal actions and our lack of capacity or our worthiness, then the mistake, which was already enough of an issue, becomes buried under a complex. And complexes are much harder to unravel. Mistake is just, there's Maya, what did I expect? A complex has now defined us by our limitation. And if we define ourselves by our limitation, we are much more susceptible to delusion. Guilt is like throwing that rock into the middle of the pond, the ripples start going out, they hit the shore, they come back, they hit the shore, they come back. If we just make a mistake, we're just off course and we just go back on it again. For some reason, it's a very difficult teaching for some of us. I have had the longest, hardest cycle with that. Just this exaggerated sense of my Well, see, what it really is, it's very weird. It's like, I think I'm perfect. I think I should be perfect, which is such an exaggerated sense of who I actually am, that when that perfection, the lack of perfection is exposed, then there's an equal and opposite plunge to the other side. Whereas the fact is, and I've sort of said this to people a number of times, most of us just kind of float around in the kind of mediocre middle. You know, we're neither the worst nor the best. But some of that mediocrity seems harder to bear, you know, than this dramatic sense of perfection or despair. But the fact is, things happen. Just about as boring as that. We get drawn off course. There you have it. This woman at Mount Washington, when Master was living, she left to get married. She moved away from the ashram. She had a child. It proved to be a mistake. She came back. She just moved back into the ashram. One of the other more narrow-minded sisters said to her, because the Master just welcomed her back, said, you know, basically, how dare you show your face here after having gone away and disobeyed Master to that extent. And the woman, who was very strong-minded, just said back, she said, do you want me to worship my mistake for the rest of my life? Isn't that a powerful answer? Why would we worship our mistake by making it the center of our concentration, even for a minute? It happened. Let it go. Is that easy? No. But bliss hones our discrimination. Guilt does not make us happy. It is not an action that makes us closer to bliss. And for that reason, let us unite together in our commitment not to do it, to be blown off course, and then simply return to our pre-established destiny. God bless you.